for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Kimberly Konzak and have had the privilege of working with Nikki Latini the last few years. Nikki is known in the grants industry as the subject matter expert in indirect costs, so you are all in good company. This session is intended to cover the basics of indirect costs, including calculation and the process of negotiating with the federal cognizant agency. We will also provide a background on ARPA funding, focusing on the multiple ways indirect costs can be leveraged to maximize your ARPA funding, grant funding, and more. If you have any questions for Nikki today, please add those in the Q&A throughout, and let's get started.
Kimberly. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki Latini, director here over at Bekaert for the Indirect Cost Services. Thanks for taking your time out of your day. I really appreciate and look forward to having this conversation. And again, any questions that you might have, please feel free. We can answer them as soon as we can get to them. And if we're not able to finish answering them before the end of this session, we will follow up and make sure you guys get answers to those questions. So don't be shy. I've been doing nothing but cost allocation and indirect cost for the last, sorry, I'm trying to get my screen is not there. I've been doing nothing but indirect costs and cost allocation for the last 23 years. It's been my entire career. So I'm hoping that I can share some of that knowledge with you today and the experiences that I've had throughout my career. The areas of topics that we're going to talk about are: what is indirect cost? Why are we even here to talk about it? What does it mean to your organization? Why is it important? We're going to talk through some of the background of ARPA funding and then the current state. Where are we at? What's the obligation interim rule? And then leveraging those indirect costs on grants, the benefits, and then some of our services we'll talk through at the very end. So an overview of our cost allocation and cost recovery services is really about filling the gaps in our clients' financial processes for fiscal health. It's really important that we understand what it's costing us to provide services, not only on ARPA, but on everything that you do, also on all of your non-grant funding areas. So programs have costs and indirect costs, and it's important to understand that. So by calculating our indirect costs, we can leverage that rate on past unspent dollars in your grant portfolio, and also look for new opportunities that is now unrestricted and areas where you guys can provide more services. So for our first polling question, have you fully obligated your ARPA funding? Yes or no? It's just a question that we'd like to ask. Okay, so this is our result. So what we're seeing is 38% said yes, so fabulous job, that's amazing. And then 62% said no. So then hopefully we can answer some questions and help you out through this process. But also for the ones that have fully obligated, there's still opportunities for you to make sure that we can release obligation dates or spend dates, as well as your administrative burden. So we'll go through that process as well. So to kick it off, though, I'd like to talk about the sustainability and impact of indirect cost. We're going to talk a little bit about cost allocation plans and what those are for your organization. It's really that understanding of the 30,000-foot view of everything that you do, regardless of the funding source. So what are your support departments? Do we have HR, payroll, facilities, all of those areas that are supporting these programs? And then the annual dollar amount is what is the result of that per program or grant or any services that you're performing. And this really helps to inform your organization about the true cost of those services. Then that translates into an indirect cost rate, which is a percentage you can apply to every dollar. So this really helps for budgeting purposes. If you're looking at a future grant, do you know what it's going to cost you? And I'm going to tell you on ARPA, this is a conversation that with all the clients I've come across and the people I've talked to, this has never even been a consideration. And so what's the impact on your general fund or on your reserves or your fundraising areas if you're a nonprofit? So what does that mean when you don't know what your indirect cost rate is? And what that leads you to is the understanding of what your true cost of service is to make better strategic decisions, and then knowing how you can achieve your maximum reimbursement and maximize your impact on programs. Obviously, that's why we're all here. That's why we're in these services of nonprofits and governments and public sector, is really to support the constituents and to service them in the most impactful way that we can. So this is a key component in that. So if you take nothing else from this conversation, this is always my most important slide. We talk so much about direct cost, indirect cost separately. We act as if one can happen without the other. We really need to shift that conversation to true cost. True cost is really, what is it costing you to provide these services? Indirect cost does not exist if it doesn't have direct cost to support, and direct cost can't operate without the support of indirect cost. So why do we separate it? I always like to use the example of payroll because everyone relates to it. So the idea behind this conversation here is, what is it costing you to do the program? Well, to me, when you're working on these programs directly on these services, you're looking at it from a perspective of you're going to get a paycheck to do your job. And everyone wants their paycheck, right? And so there's a cost associated with processing that paycheck. So to me, it's not an optional cost. So the fact that we separate it to me doesn't make sense just simply because of the nature of the function of the service, because every single aspect of those costs really are what it takes to provide those services. So we really need to look at that. Hidden costs are those indirect costs. And I think that we oftentimes avoid these conversations because we just don't know. We don't know what it's costing us. So it's easier to just look at our direct cost of the program and really make that in our head what it's costing, because it's not easy to identify the hidden cost. You have to go through a process to really identify what those indirect costs are. How do we spread those costs to the services and to the programs that they're supporting? And then what does that mean for you? And so in many organizations, you're subsidizing indirect. If not the full amount, you're definitely subsidizing a big chunk of that. And is that your intention? Sometimes it might be. It might be an intention in some areas to cover or subsidize those indirect costs, but at least you should know what they are in order to make sure that when you are making decisions moving forward, that you know how you're going to find those extra dollars. If you're a nonprofit, do you know how much you're going to have to fundraise to support this program? And does that make sense at this time in your organization? Same with government. You know, we are all trying to do more. And so can you really do more with what you're given? You know, and ARPA is a incredible example of this service or of this issue or this problem. Is the amount of funding that has come in for ARPA allowed agencies to provide amazing services, extensive services, lots of infrastructure, all those things, but that comes at a cost. And so do we know what that is? I would say on average throughout my career, I would say that organizations really have about a 30 to 40% indirect cost rate. And that might surprise a lot of you. But if you think about that from the perspective of what you're subsidizing, this can really put you at risk if you're not paying attention to that. So one of the things I like to see is, because the world sees the glacier sitting on top of the water, right? They only see the direct cost. This is the program. That's what everyone sees. But really, it takes all of the indirect costs to hold up that glacier, to hold up that program. You need the support of that, or else it just sink. And so the idea is I know it's a simplistic graphic, but I think it's a really poignant point to make. And I think that the perception of the public is we want all the money to go to and actually even us internally, we want all the money to go to the project or the program. We don't want to waste it on indirect cost. And that's the idea, is it's not a waste. It's critical to the support of that program. So it's how do we shift that conversation and that perspective to make sure that everyone understands that it is critical, and this is the cost of our services. All right, so our second polling question: have you claimed indirect cost on your ARPA funding? Wow, this is a pretty good even balance. Have you claimed indirect cost on your ARPA? For those of you who have, that's fantastic. You know, a lot of organizations don't go through that process because, again, they want all the funds to go to the project. So good job on if you haven't. If you haven't, there's still time. So that's why we're here today. We're going to talk through that, and there's still time for that. Okay, so now getting more specifically into ARPA funding. There's going to be a lot of information on these slides. I'm not going to read them verbatim, so you guys will have access to this information. But I just wanted to give a little background first to kind of talk through. I'm sure most of you guys know this information, but it is important to see kind of some of the breakout of the different things, where the ARPA funding went, what are the different opportunities for organizations and that. But in total, $1.9 trillion has gone out for ARPA funding. And so that's why this obligation deadline at the end of the year in 2024 is very important, because whatever is not obligated is going back. So we want to keep that number at 1.9 so that we still have the opportunity to spend for the next couple years, whatever is there and left over for those programs. State and local funding, you'll see the different acronyms that they have, the state and local fiscal recovery funds, and then the local fiscal recovery funds. So you might see these acronyms. I just call it ARPA. It's easier for me to kind of encompass everything, but it means the same thing, SLFRF, and LFRF. Eligible uses of funds. So those are, all the different small businesses, nonprofits, all of those have health and emergency funding available, eligible for premium pay for essential workers, revenue replacement, water, sewer infrastructure, broadband infrastructure. These are really important projects that we've all done and used to obligate these funds. Ineligible, you guys can read that. I'm sure mostly everyone knows this, and so it's really just something for reference points. But the main things are the infrastructure and the public health response and the pay are really the big things that these ARPA funds are going for. So as far as expenditure reports, there are requirements of how you report on these ARPA funding. And so the population of over 250 have to do quarterly reports and an annual recovery plan. And those are submitted in mid-year. And then population under 250,000, but more than 10 million in funding, they also have to do quarterly project reports, but they don't have to do the annual recovery performance reports. And then under 250,000 and less than 10, only have to do the annual reporting. So there are different degrees. In a lot of my reading, I found that there are actually still a lot of agencies not reporting on that. So they're working on what do they do. So they don't have a complete look at everything that's going on, but they're getting a pretty good understanding. We already kind of talked about the different spend categories. What I see most is significant amounts in negative economic impact, infrastructure, public health, administrative, and premium pay. I see that a lot. A lot of people have opted with the revenue replacement, but I was actually surprised there's some agencies that took a lot of revenue replacement just simply to eliminate some of the reporting opportunities, but then are still using them on all of these programs. They just did it in a different way, versus others that just took a minimal amount of revenue replacement and still have theirs to really take care of. So as of March 31st, 2023. So this is the latest information, unfortunately, because obviously that's a year ago, but we can at least look at this as kind of giving an idea of the state of the ARPA funding. But in the most recent data, the states reported obligating 60% or 118 billion of the spending, and spending 45% of the awards they've received to date, whereas the localities are at 54% obligated and about 38% spent. So there's still significant opportunities for making sure that we can leverage the dollars, because again, we want to make sure that 1.9 trillion stays 1.9 trillion. So there's some work to be done in this process, and we're going through. These are just kind of some graphics for you to kind of see it across the country. What are the percent of ARPA funds that are obligated? And so I can, if you kind of briefly look over the different areas, the ones that are in the light blue are less than 24%. And then I would say the most common is 50 to 74% of the ARPA funds have been obligated. That looks like the majority of the areas, which is, at this point in time, as we still have 2 years left, That's great, but unfortunately, we only have 1 year to represent that obligation, make sure that all the contracts are in place, the POs. And as we know, that deadline is fast approaching. It takes time to get those things in place. And so it's just something to keep in mind as you navigate through these ARPA fundings. And then here's where you see is spent by state. So what I would say the most common area, I would say more than half of the country is, 0 to 50%, basically, the first two. So there's still a lot of time for spend. And so when I talk about that, why that's so important is this is some of the area that we really want to leverage that indirect cost. You're protecting those funds. You still have opportunities to put them right back into the program, and we'll talk more about that as we move on. But it's something that you might have gone into this ARPA funding with the expectation of running these projects with the same perception that we always have on all grant funds, which is you want it going all to the program, but we really need to step back and look at that conversation like the earlier slide where I talked about the true cost and what it's really costing you to provide these services. ARPA was all new, well, I shouldn't say unexpected, but it was one of those things where you might have had a list in your organization of all these ideal projects you wanted to complete in the perfect world. And then this money came out and you were able to access and do a lot of those reports. Those programs that you were not necessarily expecting to do all at once. You were going to, fit into it. And I had a very large tribal government that I worked with where we had conversations and they got $1 billion in ARPA funding. And one of the conversations we had was, okay, have you programmed out all of these funds? And they were like, yeah, we have everything programmed out, all $1 billion. This is great. We're so excited. And I said, okay, well, you have a 33% indirect cost rate. So you have approximately, if some of them indirect cost isn't applicable, like revenue recovery and some of the infrastructure, but let's say half of it has indirect cost, you have at least $150 million of administrative and indirect cost. Where is that coming from? Do you know how your general fund is going to support that? Have you considered that? Do we need to maybe reduce the level of project expectations and do less projects, but make sure everything is fully funded to its proper amount? So those are the things we really need to think about as we move through the spend of the ARPA is what is happening? What is the burden being put on your support services to manage that? And what does that mean to the other programs that you do on a daily basis that aren't even related to grant funding? So are you burdening those programs because you're utilizing that money in the wrong direction and not for the services that they're supporting? So percentage of ARPA dollars spent, you'll notice that the largest percent of dollars spent are less than 25%. So if we only have 2.5 more years to spend it, what does that mean? And what if you get to 2026 and you're in the middle of a program and they take the money back? So are we protecting those funds and making sure that you have leveraged them in every way possible from being taken back? And then you can use that and be able to have the space to breathe so that you can then decide, even if you've collected it as indirect cost, you can put it right back into the program. If that's really the desire of the agency, if that's what you want to do, then that's what you do. But free yourself up to have that peace of mind that that choice can be made rather than it just getting down to the wire and not be taken away. So this is something I think is a very interesting breakdown of kind of where the dollars have gone, that you can really see this. And so administrative 0.4% of the overall ARPA dollars has been spent on administration. I can tell you all right now there's not a single organization, operation, business, county, nonprofit, anyone on earth whose indirect cost or administration cost is 0.4%, not even 1% of your costs. So that means, and what that tells me is that most of the people are not drawing the available indirect cost or what it's really costing them to provide these services. And as I mentioned again, what does that mean to the other services that you're performing within your organization, and how are they affected by this? So again, I think that this is a really impactful visual that shows you kind of where the dollars are going and then how they're being represented. Which leads me to a slide where I think it's important to now put that 0.4% in perspective. What does that mean in terms of dollars? So we have 0.4% of the spend is on administrative costs, and approximately 54% of ARPA spend would be eligible for indirect cost. So as I mentioned before, not all costs are eligible. Revenue recovery, a lot of the infrastructure, things like that are not eligible to apply the indirect cost. But if 54% of the spend of these programs that are being budgeted out have the ability to collect your indirect cost rate, and as I talked to you about the average indirect cost rates of 30 to 40%, if we took that $1.9 trillion, broke that down to the 54% that has the opportunity to collect indirect cost, that's $998 billion that can be eligible for reimbursement. Currently, only 76 billion is being used on administration. That's that 0.4%. So if 76 billion is being used and the average indirect cost is 30%, that 30%, if you're applying it to the 998,000, I know there's a lot of math involved here, guys, but you can process it a little bit more later. But basically, the average indirect cost rate at 30% and applying that to the available eligible costs for reimbursement at the 998, that gives you almost $300 billion in indirect costs. That means that's what's being spent. Doesn't mean that's what's being collected. Obviously, we're seeing only 76 billion so far. So almost $300 billion is really what it's costing to support this $1.9 trillion in spend. So opportunities that sit with us, and why we're here today and why we're having this conversation is, of all the organizations, of all the funding, of all the things that are happening, $223.4 billion is there to leverage. Now, as I mentioned, you can still, as an organization, and I keep reiterating this point because I think it's important, you don't have to change your thinking around putting all the dollars to the program. However you want to say that or do that, you can make that decision in your organization. And you can make it where some programs you're going to subsidize and other programs you're not. But once you protect those dollars, you can put it right back into the program, but you don't report on it. And you're no longer tied to a date of spend in 2026. So the opportunity is there for everyone to capture these dollars.
And Nikki, someone actually just asked, and you answered it, but it might be worth expanding upon the limitations on how you can spend the indirect cost recoveries. And you basically just said it's unrestricted. You can spend it however you wish.
Yeah. So the idea behind it is the indirect cost rate, because you have to negotiate your rate. Once it is negotiated, the rate is set. You no longer, when you submit for indirect reimbursement, you are literally saying, I spent $500,000. My indirect cost rate is 30%. This is my indirect cost. You don't have to say the indirect cost consists of $50 in payroll, $700 in HR costs. You don't have to break that out. You just simply have to use that rate. Those dollars then come in, because think about it. Whatever you've already spent in ARPA in the last couple years, if you haven't collected indirect cost, you subsidized it. So subsidizing it means you used it and took it out of your general fund to support it, but you didn't put it back there. So once you bring it back in, it's no longer tied to the program. If you don't want it to be, it's now in the general fund, unrestricted. You make that decision on where you want to put it. You can use it for other things because you've spent it on the grant already. You've spent it on ARPA already, but you can also then say, well, I'm doing this to do more of reducing the administrative burden and releasing the deadlines. And then that way, by doing that, you're still going to put the money back into the program. So you're no longer really taking the indirect cost, but you took it for a protection mechanism and then you put it right back in. Yeah, and you don't have to be consistent one program to another. You can make that decision on a one by one basis. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about too is the obligation interim final rule. There were some insights in some of the things that have gone on. There was a revision to focus on the flexibility of the obligation and provide clarity to the original guidance. Talked about the deadline being unchanged of December 31st, and the IFR is effective immediately to allow recipients to meet the financial deadlines and incur costs. So those are the key insights to what the rule was. The significant updates, there were 3 major amendments that have happened. One was the flexibility and clarification around the definition of obligation. The second was the clarification or the obligation in respect to the subrecipients. And then 3, the flexibility and clarification around the replacements of contracts and subawards. So to the part 1 of flexibility and clarification, one of the things I think is really important here, because we're talking about indirect costs, the administration and legal personnel costs, the indirect administration costs can actually be considered obligated. So if you're able to look at a program that you're obligating, you can actually apply some of those costs as administration as you have an indirect cost rate to represent, like if you have a $15 million project that you need to obligate before December 31st, on that $15 million, $3 million of it is administration. That can be obligated as administration without having to represent those costs because you have the indirect cost rate. So you're not having to, it's like a set aside, if you will. So this is for their future spend. You're putting it aside to say, I've quote unquote obligated. They can no longer take those funds, even if I haven't fully, if I didn't obligate or get contracts for the full amount based on the budgets that they're presenting to do the work. It allows you that opportunity to then fill the gap of that obligation without having to, show the spend per se. You use the indirect cost. So that I think was a major important clarification to make, because again, this is a representation of the federal government acknowledging indirect cost exists. So we needed to talk about that. Part 2 was to provide the flexibility and provide a list of administrative legal costs for the recipients. What are some of the things that you can include in that administration costs? And then the requirements as to the obligation. So you are able to report the estimate to the Treasury by April 30th, 2024 to provide explanation of the amounts determined, and then report the final amount extended by the end of the year. The recipient's current indirect cost rates or the de minimis rate may be continued to utilize through the end date of the funding period of performance. That was an important statement. The deadline for subrecipients is once the recipient is entered into the subaward agreement with the subrecipient, the subaward amount is considered incurred by the recipient. So this in turn obligates those dollars. So that's important to understand. And as the subrecipient is concerned, they cannot incur the expenditures beyond ARPA's expenditure deadline of 2026. The replacement of contracts and subawards, high level, you must terminate the contract and subaward of default. It's allowable. The recipient and contractor mutually agree to terminate. So it's one of those things that you can't just obligate and then terminate on the other side. That's the idea. There has to be justification and reason so that, it doesn't show that you were just filling a stopgap, basically. The recipients must not amend a contract or subaward with intention of avoiding the obligation deadline. So that's kind of the key to this particular clarification. So the indirect cost rate and cost recovery services. So what does all this mean related to your ARPA and your grant portfolio? So something I want to make sure, although we've focused a lot on some of the definitions of ARPA and being able to leverage this indirect cost rate on that, I want to make sure that we understand there's more to this story. So Not only is it your ARPA, the reason why we're focusing on that is just simply the deadlines that are coming about, that it's on top of mind of everyone. But this is actually a service that relates to your entire grant portfolio. These are opportunities for your grant portfolio. So we calculate the true cost. You're better informed on what these costs are. You have longer lasting fiscal awareness of everything. By doing a cost allocation and indirect cost rate, you are setting yourself up to be successful, sustainable, and have better information. You know, we all go after, you know, talking in a generalization of grants, oftentimes we're going after the dollars because we just want to get as much as we can, not recognizing that sometimes that means we're putting ourselves at risk. Sometimes it costs more to get certain dollars than you actually get. So the indirect costs can be higher in some areas that you're unaware of. So do you know how you're going to cover these costs if you have to subsidize? So for example, with a nonprofit, you have to fundraise extra if you're not doing this, if you're not looking into what it's costing and knowing that going in, and knowing the amount you actually need to fundraise. That is something that's really important in a nonprofit. You don't want to end up waking up tomorrow and realizing those dollars are not there. And what are you going to do to make sure you continue to keep the doors open? In a governmental agency, we look at the fact that this is a zero-sum game. You have support services, you have cost of doing business and doing that. And we who live in this country and pay our taxes, we have expectations of what those dollars are going to be spent on. So when I know when I pay my taxes, I expect that when I pay my taxes, you're going to put more police officers on the street. I'm going to be able to take my kids to the park. We're going to have services and parks and recreation and different groups of soccer for our kids, and all of those things is where our taxpayer dollars really go. If you take on these programs and put out all these projects as a choice, and you choose to not capture your indirect costs and you subsidize it, that means you're taking it away on the other side. You're taking it away from those public safety services, those parks and rec services. And I know most people don't really think like that, and it's not intentional by any means. It's just the reality of the situation is we have to make a decision as an organizational whole, what subsidies we're willing to provide and where are areas that we can maximize this opportunity and make sure that every dollar we can bring in from the federal or state government, we are accessing so that more things can happen on the other end. So just kind of a quick little look, as I mentioned, we're talking about the entire grant portfolio that exists within your organization, not just ARPA funding. That the same is true in terms of what are the dollars? $4.5 trillion were obligated in 2024. So you do 30% of that and, you know, think about how many billions of dollars that is, or even a trillion. It's probably a trillion. Yeah, it is. So those costs are really being spent on the administrative. And is that what everyone's getting back? That's a question to ask yourself. So how do we get these dollars back in, and what does that mean? So looking back on the last 2 years of how much you've subsidized your indirect costs. So some people will take a 10% de minimis, some people won't take any. And again, the perception is, please don't take money away from my program. So we have to change that perception and have those conversations about the overall sustainability about the organization. But we're allowed to look back 2 years. So the ARPA funds, that's what you've spent to date, we can look back and apply the indirect cost rate to those spends so that you can capture those dollars. We want to make sure that you are protecting every dollar or receiving every dollar that is available to you. For many opportunities and many reasons within your grant portfolio, whatever it might be, you don't fully draw down on an award. That happens, resources, timing, whatever it is. I don't know that I've met an organization to date that has spent every dollar they received unless they have only a few grants. So what have you subsidized? Do you know what that is? And then what if I told you you can access those unspent dollars that are no longer available to you because the grant has ended, the grant period has ended? But because you actually subsidize the indirect cost during the grant period, you can get those dollars back and put them into your general fund unrestricted. So looking at that is really important and a very incredible opportunity for organizations. So separate from the ARPA funds, if we are looking at just your grant portfolio, you can look back 2 years and all those dollars come into your general fund, unrestricted, unbudgeted. You can do whatever you want with it. Whereas for the ARPA funding, as I mentioned before, you might still have the philosophy or the expectation that you want to put all of those dollars in those programs. You have the right to do so. But grab the indirect costs now. Grab them and make sure you know that those dollars are protected, that you don't want to get down to the end of the wire and realize, oh man, I didn't capture this. And by the time it's 2026, now that's 4 years. You can only go back 2. So you would have lost those first 2 years of the ARPA spend and protecting those funds. So get out there, leverage that indirect cost, maximize your opportunities, really get that. A quick example that I wanted to give that I think gives context to what we're talking about, because I don't think people really understand the impact of not knowing what your indirect cost is. So I'll give a quick example. Back years ago, there was a big push for body cams for police officers to have them. The cities wanted that so that they can be more transparent and protect their officers. The public wanted them because they wanted to make sure there wasn't, wrongful force or whatever it might be, that everyone was being treated fairly. So it was a common goal of both sides. And so a whole bunch of grant funding came out to purchase the actual body cams, the physical equipment. What happened was police departments across the country went after these dollars, not really realizing what it was really going to cost them. And so what happened was, let's say we did a study and there was like a $500,000 body cam grant and they got $500,000 to buy the equipment. What they didn't recognize is with that equipment, which they are now forced to implement because they accepted the grant, that they now need to catalog 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single officer. They need to catalog those videos by date, time, location, officer, all those things. They need to be able to store that information, all of that information, in the cloud. And back then, 10, 15 years ago, it was even that much more expensive for storage in the cloud. They need to be able to reference all of those and maintain and store them for 7 years. It increased the public records requests. And then someone who would request that would have to then, someone on the side of the city, before that could be given out, had to sit and actually blur out the faces of everyone that wasn't part of that didn't give that public records request. It increased the amount of legal action happening. So more counsel time, more legal expenses, and the list goes on. So the idea is that with this $500,000 grant, it costs $3.2 million a year to operate. So that is something that was very important to recognize going into it. Now, they still might have made the choice to go after it because it was something everyone wanted, but maybe they could have gone to council or they could have put it on the ballot to the public. Should we raise our sales tax to cover some of these dollars? What does everyone want? You need to know what it costs.
Nikki, we have a few questions coming
Sure.
in, kind of similar in nature, talking about how you would categorize indirect cost in the budget and in the reporting, but also how it relates to the administrative piece of it, because there was a deadline of April 30th of this year to obligate those administrative costs. So maybe talk a little bit about differentiating between the administrative costs and then indirect costs.
Great questions. Okay, so the obligation of the indirect cost is really more of a generalization on the management of ARPA. So when you have obligated a section of administrative costs, it was really for oversight of programs, oversight of all of those things that relate to just receiving the ARPA. Like many organizations who have received a significant amount of ARPA hire a consultant to manage all the reporting, to manage all the programs and do all that. That cost is an administrative cost that you were obligating or creating a section for in your ARPA spend. But the difference between the indirect cost and that administration bucket that you will, if you call that, call that out as far as an obligation, is an indirect cost rate includes all areas of agency-wide indirect as well as departmental indirect. So when we're talking about indirect cost rates, we look at not only the indirect costs that might be for like the supervisors overseeing a handful of programs, which is the departmental indirect, but the agency-wide, which is the payroll, the IT, the HR, the facilities, that's all rolled into this rate. And so for every program you're operating, there is indirect costs associated with that program costs. So if you have a project that you're working on under the ARPA funds and you had a budget that said, we're going to spend $15 million on this program, this does not relate to the administration that you set aside. This relates to your spend on that program specific. So your indirect cost program specific. So let's say you've spent $10 million to date on this $15 million programmatic budget that you set aside for ARPA. There's still $5 million remaining. So if you had a 30% indirect cost rate, $3 million of that is indirect cost. So if you've spent the 10 million. So $3 million is available to you in indirect based on your indirect cost rate. So you can apply that to that program. So now technically you've spent 13 million of that 15 million. And what it does for you is if you still expect to fully spend that $15 million, you can still do that. It's just now you're using some of that $3 million that you classified as indirect off your $10 million spend. And you no longer need to report on those dollars. You can completely, sorry, I had some noise in the back. Anyways, so you can completely leverage those dollars back into the program and spend $5 million back on the remaining amount of the program. But that 3 million you wouldn't need to report on. You can, if you reach 2026 and you haven't spent all your dollars, that $3 million isn't tied to the indirect cost. So again, it's an opportunity for you to protect those funds, reduce the administrative burden, but that's the difference between the admin as a organizational whole of managing the ARPA funds versus, and like the subrecipient monitoring and all that would be part of the administration. But this is talking about specific programmatically each and every one. So I hope that answers the question.
And kind of along those lines too, and you may have this that you want to speak up later, so we can table it if you think, for now. But what if you don't have a negotiated rate?
Great. That's a great question. So there's still many opportunities. So one, you need to have an indirect cost rate and we need to negotiate. And the reason why I use my little air quotes is because depending on the size of your organization and your grant portfolio, if you have, as a governmental organization, less than $35 million in direct federal funding, excluding ARPA. So we don't talk about ARPA, that has nothing to do with it. So your regular grant portfolio, if you have less than 35 million, you are not required to negotiate through your cognizant agency. You have to prepare the indirect cost rate with all supplemental information, with everything necessary, and create a packet that would be the same as what you would submit. But instead of submitting it, you sit it on the shelf. And then we have a letter from the White House, so you can always reach out to us. But we have a letter from the White House that states, because this is one of the areas of the uniform guidance that was a little unclear for a lot of agencies. And so sometimes the federal would push back because of their interpretation and whatever it might be. But the White House has defined that says we can't possibly negotiate every single rate for every single organization across the country that receives a dollar of funds. So we're going to create a threshold, and we'll formally do a negotiation agreement if you're over 35 million. And for nonprofits, it's 10 million. So if you're over 10 million in direct federal spend, or then you can get a formal one. If you're not, and you're less than, then you don't. And so those ones, it's actually great because you can calculate the rate today and use it tomorrow. And so the idea is the letter from the White House that states, anytime a funder would request that you give them the negotiated rate, you hand them this letter and the rate that you've calculated, and you say, or the letter says that they cannot require you to get a physical negotiated agreement. They must accept this rate as is, or they have to negotiate it for you, the funder. They cannot force you to take a de minimis rate or exclude if you don't have that formal, because of the fact that it's considered negotiated, and the funder has the opportunity to go through the process, but they usually don't because they don't have the necessary staff or the resources or even the knowledge to do that, because that wasn't what they do at that local level of where the funding is. So you basically now have what's equivalent to a negotiated agreement. So that's what you need to do. But if you don't have that at all, if you have no indirect cost rate, then what I'm talking about doesn't apply, because you have to be able to have that rate. But it's a lot easier to get it done in some situations than others. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't for the larger organizations. It just takes a little longer as it sits in the queue. But we can negotiate multiple years at one time. So when you're submitting a negotiated agreement to be reviewed and approved, you can submit all years that you want to apply it for those 3 years, the current and 2 years back, so that you're using that time wisely and you're not just submitting one moving forward. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, so leveraging that today and beyond, if you're identifying your indirect cost subsidized to date for your total ARPA, you need to understand what that is. Draw down the indirect cost to protect those funds, as I've been talking about. You can put it right back into the program. You can make those choices, but protect those funds. Do it today. Do it now. Understand what that is. Then on your whole grant portfolio, maximize your grant reimbursement. As I mentioned, you can leverage what was unspent on any of your awards in the last 2 years and grab any indirect that you might not have captured that you would have been subsidizing, put it into your general fund. And then going forward, understanding what your rate is, you have the ability to, one, budget more accurately, make sure that you can cover any subsidy that you might need to for the indirect cost rate. So you're being more proactive in your approach to your grant portfolio. Like, how much can your agency bear? Can you make sure that you're going to be able to cover those costs? But in addition to this, if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, you can use it as your match component. And so what that means is it's opened the door for many organizations who did not have the opportunity to go after match grants because they didn't have the cash to set aside. Now what they can do is actually use their indirect cost rate when they apply, and they do not have to set aside any dollars. So it really opens the doors to a lot of organizations to be able to do that. So our cost recovery services, as I mentioned, is that we go in, we can calculate that indirect cost rate for you. We can do that process. So we go in, we do that process, we calculate your indirect cost rate. If you already have a consultant who's preparing your cost allocation plan and your indirect cost rate, we can use that. We don't have to come in and do the indirect cost rate as well. So this cost recovery service is not limited to coming in and having to do it all, because some agencies think that that's the case, but this is a totally different service. It's what happens after the rate. That's what we're doing. So what this means for you guys is you're claiming indirect costs on the ARPA funds to protect those dollars. You're getting indirect cost reimbursement on the grant portfolio of dollars that were left unspent that remember, you otherwise would have no access to, and you would have lost. And that comes in. So as far as the perception of putting all the dollars to the program, that eliminates that statement, because there's no more dollars that could be put toward that program, even if there was still an award. That comes back into your general fund, unrestricted, and everything that you need to do that. And then unobligated ARPA funding is preserved. And so what I mean by, if you're calculating indirect costs and you're adjusting programs, that, let's say you had that $15 million program I said, and you want to adjust it to $20 million during this period and reduce another program that you had in place to try to do in the next 2 years, you now have eliminated the need to obligate that new program, and you've reshifted the dollars back over to another program and protecting it with the indirect cost. So I get that that might be a little hard to digest while I just said that. And so it's something that sometimes people have to really process, or I have to show like a roadmap. So please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to kind of talk through that a little bit more. It's kind of hard sometimes when you're getting so much information to really process some of the unique mechanisms that we have, that we found to work to protect unobligated funds, to reduce administrative burden, to reduce the, or not reduce, take away any spend deadlines, all those things. But we have those, we can answer those questions for you. Another polling question. Do you apply an indirect cost rate to your grants? And this is in general. And do you want me to answer some of those questions while people are doing that, Kimberly? Are there any more questions?
Yeah, there are a few. We're trying to get through them. So if you see any out there that are open, feel free to see, because I think some of them you might have answered already.
Oh, okay. That's fine. Just one.
One question. Let's see, there was one good one that just kind of puts the math to it. So if I'm planning to spend $100 on a project and my indirect cost rate is 25%, I can obligate $25 as indirect cost and $75 for the program. And then I only need to spend or pay out the $75 by 12/31/26.
Absolutely.
True.
Yes, true.
Great.
Yep. Okay, so we apply indirect cost rate, NICRA 30%. That's awesome. And I think it was pretty even across the board for the 10% de minimis or the none. Now, I know everyone likes the 10% de minimis because they think of it as easy. And I understand if you're a smaller organization, that you don't want to go through the effort, and at least it's something. And yeah, it's raising up to 15%. But just keep in mind that there's a lot of things that don't apply if you're using the 10% de minimis. Like, for example, you can't use it for your match component. So you'd have to have an indirect cost rate, a NICRA, you'd have to have that. And then different areas, like the 10% doesn't tell you what it's costing you to provide these services. It doesn't tell you, you know, how to budget appropriately. It just tells you like, okay, you're going to get a little bit for indirect cost. And then as far as the ARPA spend, you're not maximizing the protections in place by doing a 10% de minimis. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're working through it. Benefits. I know we're running shy on time, so I will hurry up. Maximize unspent dollars and your grant portfolio. We've kind of already touched on all this. You'll be able to really look at this type of information through what we've talked about. Administrative reporting is eliminated because once you've captured it in indirect, remember it's already spent. So you reported that you spent indirect by using the indirect cost rate on whatever you spent. Now it's done. There's no more reporting. They can't take it away. There's no restrictions of spend. There's nothing that you're forced to do. So where this is a good protection for the future too, that if you're not able to spend all your ARPA by 2026, then you've put away, like, let's say you had a project that was in the middle of being completed, and it's 2026 and they were going to take the rest of the money. Well, if you've protected some of this indirect cost, you can, you know, redirect it back to this other program so you can finish it out. So there's opportunities there for you. And then your sustainability. You need to make sure that you can make informed decisions, understand what it's costing you to do these programs and really, go. So how it works, we calculate the indirect cost and the cost allocation plan, obtain the NICRA for your cognizant agency, whether that be creating the packet and sitting on the shelf, adding the letter from the White House, or actually getting a negotiated agreement, and then applying the NICRA on the direct funded information of your grant portfolio as well as ARPA. So again, remember, even if you're sitting on this call, you've fully obligated your ARPA funding, great. You still have opportunities not only to leverage that on your ARPA funding, but then also your whole grant portfolio. So the approach is, we just told you what we do with that. So we prepare those drawdowns for our clients and help to submit to the funders. We negotiate on your behalf, but if you already have a negotiated rate, we can leverage that and really make sure that you're maximizing your opportunities. And then our last polling question is, would you like us to follow up on how we can maximize your revenue by leveraging indirect cost? All right, I think we're almost done with that one. We'll close out. And so for any of you with questions, if we didn't get to your questions, we'll be sure to respond to them after the webinar and make sure, and we'll centralize that to all the participants that are here today, so that you guys can get the answers to those questions, because I'm sure a lot of you are thinking the same things or have the same questions.
Participants and recipients, right?
Yes, and recipients, exactly. So that's all for today. Kimberly, did you have a closing statement? Because we are out of time.
Yes. So just wanted to thank you all for attending this session. Know that there is a lot of information out there, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us anytime. We are all about education and want everyone to be sure to be maximizing this funding and not leaving anything on the table. So of course we value your feedback and ask that you take part in a short survey, which will appear when you leave the session. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Oh, very much.